welcome to PW English YouTube channel. I'm Shalini Somashekar, your botany teacher, and in today's lecture, we are going to be discussing the last chapter in your biology 12th grade syllabus, which is Biodiversity and Conservation. And as always, as a part of your summary series, we are going to be summarizing this chapter in one shot. So what are we going to learn in this chapter exactly? As the name itself indicates, this is going to be about biodiversity and its conservation. So it's imperative that we start our session by trying to understand what exactly biodiversity is. Going forward, we'll learn about why exactly biodiversity needs to be conserved, why is it so important, what are the different ways in which you should conserve it, all of that. Alright, so let's get started with the session and talk about biodiversity. You know what diversity means, right? Diversity means so many different kinds. And so many different kinds of organisms existing on Earth. All of that put together, the variety in animals, the variety in plants, the variety in microbes, all the different varieties of organisms is what biodiversity is. So whatever diversity you find in living organisms is basically biodiversity. So I'll give you a couple of examples that are mentioned in your NCERT textbooks that might potentially blow your mind. There are more than 20,000 species of ants. I want you to understand how significant this is because I said 20,000 species. You know what species are, right? There are not 20,000 ants. There are 20,000 species of ants, means there are 20,000 different types of ants. That's how diverse just one group of insects ants is. Very similarly, there are more than 3 lakh species of beetles. Beetles are another group of insects. Just beetles alone are more than 3 lakh species. I want you to wrap your head around what exactly I mean by 3 lakh species. Now, if you consider animals that we're familiar with, dogs are a species, cats are a different species, crows are a species. Likewise, beetles are a type of insects. And in this beetle itself, there are more than 3 lakh species across the globe. That's how diverse just one kind of insect is on our planet. That's the beauty of our planet, right? And there are more than 28,000 species of fishes that we see in water, combining both marine life as well as freshwater fishes, right? Just fishes alone exceeds 28,000 species. That's how diverse it is. Talking about plants, I'm sure you've heard of orchids, right? Orchids produce very beautiful flowers in very pretty colors, and it's considered to be one of the most advanced group of angiosperms. These orchid species in plants, there are nearly 20,000. Here I gave you just examples of 4 different groups of organisms. We started off with ants and then beetles and then fishes and now orchids. Imagine the amount of diversity that exists across all groups on our planet. It's insane. That's how biodiverse our world is, right? So, all of this variety of life that we see on Earth, this entire variety of life, including birds and fishes and other animals and plants, all of that combined is called biodiversity, right? Now, where did this term biodiversity stem from? This term was popularized by a person who is also called the father of biodiversity. His name is Edward O. Wilson. He basically popularized this term, used it very frequently and made it popular. And the reason why he used biodiversity, the term biodiversity, is because in order to describe the combined diversity at all levels of biological organization. If you watched or studied the chapter ecosystem, you know that there are various levels of biological organization. We start off from the macromolecules that are present inside of our cells, and then we have cells, and then we have tissues, we have organs, organ systems, organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, and biomes in biosphere. These are the different levels of biological organization that we've studied about. So, in any of these levels, if you consider the diversity, I mean, consider the diversity in all of those biological levels, the combined biodiversity that you get is what he referred to as biodiversity. Now, of course, at every level of biological organization, there exists some level of biodiversity. But the most important levels of biodiversity that we are going to study in this chapter particularly are genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecological diversity. We're going to study about each one of them with examples. Alright, let's begin with genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is something that we observe within the same species. Right now, let's take the example of humans. All of us belong to the same species. Me and every one of you watching this video, we are all belonging to the same species, right? Despite being part of the same species, there are differences among all of us. Now, what is the cause for these differences? The cause for these differences lie in our DNA sequences. I'm sure you've studied in the chapter Molecular Basis of Inheritance how two individuals differ, right? The reason why there is variety among us with respect to the height, with respect to the color of our eyes, with respect to the texture of our hair is because of the kinds of genes that are present within each of us. So within the species, within each species, there is diversity, and the reason there is diversity there is because of our genes. So that is genetic diversity for you. Every one of us, despite belonging to the same species, differ in one way or the other, right? That diversity or that difference, despite belonging to the same species, is because of our genes, which is why we call this genetic diversity. There are a couple of examples pertaining to genetic diversity that you can read in your NCERT textbooks, which I've also displayed on my slide here. So first off, what is genetic diversity? A single species, one single species might show high diversity at the genetic level over its distributional range. For example, near the Himalayas or at the Himalayas, probably towards the base of the Himalayas, there is a plant called Rauwolfia vomitoria. This plant produces a chemical that is called reserpine. Though there are many plants belonging to the same species at the same area, one plant might differ from another plant that is lying right next to it in terms of how much reserpine it's producing, the concentration of reserpine, and also how potent this reserpine is. So this reserpine is a chemical that this plant produces that has medicinal value, okay? So how potent is it and how much concentration is each plant producing? That varies between different plants belonging to the same species that are found pretty much in the same area. So that is an example for genetic diversity. For example, consider us. The complexion, the color of our skin is basically dependent upon how much melanin our cells are producing. In me, it's producing probably 50%, which is why I'm brown in color. There could be some other person in whom the concentration of melanin could be much lower. So that person could be, complexion could be fairer than me. So though we are the same species, we are differing from each other because of the genes that are present in us. My genes make me brown, his genes probably make him fair. Alright, so that is one example. And if you consider our staple food rice, we have in India alone, I'm talking about India, more than 50,000 strains of rice. Now, what do we mean by strains here? I'm sure all of you have seen different kinds of dogs, right? Though dogs are all the same species, you have Labradors, and then you have Pug, and then there's a German Shepherd, and there's a Golden Retriever, and there are so many different kinds of dogs. We call them different breeds. Similarly, you can refer to different types of plants of the same species as strains or varieties. So if you consider rice, in India alone, there are more than 50,000 strains of rice. That is diversity, that is specifically genetic diversity, because we are here talking only about one species, which is rice. Within that species, you find so many different varieties, which are the different strains. Similarly, I'm sure everybody here knows that mango exists in so many different varieties, right? It is our national fruit. It is called the king of fruits, and it is my favorite fruit personally. We have so many different types of varieties that are found in India. In India alone, there are about 1,000 varieties of mangoes. If you're paying attention to this session, type in the comments at least 3 varieties of mangoes that you know. I will give you 3 varieties. One is raspberry, and there's badami, and there is Alphonse. Okay, so all these are my most favorite 3 varieties of mangoes. Whatever is your favorite, drop it down in the comment box. All right, so that's genetic diversity for you. Let's talk about species diversity. The second thing is species diversity. At the species level, over here we're going to consider how many different species are present in an area. For example, if you consider or compare the amphibian species in Western Ghats with the amphibian species in Eastern Ghats. Towards the south of India, you have the west coast and the east coast. Towards the west coast, you have the Western Ghats, and here you have the Eastern Ghats, right? There are mountains, right? There is a mountain range on both the eastern coast and the western coast towards the south. That is the Western Ghats and Eastern Ghats for you. If you consider the number of amphibian species here, the number of species of amphibians that you find in the Western Ghats far exceeds the amphibian species in the Eastern Ghats. Now, what do we understand here? We are looking at how many different species are present in a particular area. The variety in a particular species that's present in a particular area will give us the species diversity. If you compare species diversity with genetic diversity, it's very clear. In genetic diversity, we're looking at one species alone. Within that species, what is the variation? If you consider species diversity, we're looking at the number of different species that you find in an area. If there are more number of species in one area compared to another area, we say that the area that has more species is more species rich. All right. So, for example, if you could consider your house as one area and your neighbor's house as another area. In your house, you're probably just humans, and in your neighbor's house, they have a lot of pets. So, there is human species, and there is probably they have some birds, they have fishes, and they have a pet dog, they have a pet cat. So, there are obviously more species in that house than your house, right? So, over here, we're not looking at how many individuals are present, how many species are present. Let's take this example again. Here's one area. Here, let's say this is the Western Ghats. This is the Eastern Ghats. When you're talking about species diversity, you do not worry about how many of organisms belonging to a species are present there. All you have to worry about is how many types of species are there, or basically how many species are there. In Western Ghats, let's say there are 5 different species of frogs. Okay, so there's A, B, C, D, E. 5 different types of species, right? So here in Western Ghats, you have 10 of A, 2 of B, 7 of C, 3 of D, and probably 20 of E. This is the number of each species. In Eastern Ghats, you have just 3 species, A, B, and C. There's 100 of A, 200 of B, and 50 of C. Now, if you look at the number here, the number of frogs here are definitely greater than the number of frogs here. But what exactly are we measuring here? We are measuring the number of species. So, if you consider the number of species, we have 5 here, you have just 3. Regardless of the number of frogs being greater here, we say that the species diversity is greater in the Western Ghats compared to the Eastern Ghats. Now, I don't mean that in Eastern Ghats there are more number of frogs. What I'm trying to tell here is, when we talk about species diversity, we do not consider how many organisms of a species are present there. All we are trying to look at is the number of species that are present there. Alright, so I hope this has given you clarity. Now, let's talk about ecological diversity. Ecological diversity, we're basically looking at diversity at an ecosystem level. For this, we need to recollect what an ecosystem means. Ecosystem is one of the levels of biological organization. In an ecosystem, you have different communities of different species, different populations interacting with the abiotic environment, right? So, if you consider 2 countries, let's compare 2 countries. India and Norway. India has more types of ecosystems. In India, we have deserts, we have rainforests, we have mangroves, we have coral reefs, we have estuaries, alpine meadows, and we have such a great type of ecosystems. The ecosystem diversity is very great because India is, for its most part, present in the tropical region, right? Whereas when you consider a Scandinavian country like Norway, over there also you have forests, but the ecosystem diversity or the ecological diversity over there is much lesser compared to India. In India, you find all of these different kinds of ecosystems which you may not find in Norway. Definitely the number of ecosystems here will be much lower. The number of types of ecosystems will be much lower because this is a temperate country. All right. So that is ecosystem diversity for you. So yeah, you can call it ecological diversity. That is the three different types of diversity. Now, let's talk about how many different species are present in different parts of the world across the globe. Globally, what is the biodiversity, and then we'll talk about what is the biodiversity that we find in India, right? According to the IUCN, IUCN is short for International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. According to the IUCN's 2004 report, the total number of plants and animals that have been described so far is slightly more than 1.5 million. All of the plants across the world that have been described so far are more than 1.5 million. This is an important number for you to remember. Now, what we must understand here is each one of these 1.5 million is an individual species. We do not have 1.5 million organisms. We have 1.5 million species. In each species, there are probably thousands of organisms, and that is how biodiverse our planet is, right? So, it is described slightly more than 1.5 million. This number is only of the species that have been described so far. There are probably millions of species that are present away from us, not yet noticed by us, waiting to be discovered. So you don't yet know about their number. Of what has been described so far, this is the number we've arrived at, right? So we don't yet know, we don't have a clear idea of how many more species are yet to be discovered. Many people have come up with different estimates that are very variable. Some say a few million, some say several million, or some estimates even run to billions. So we're not exactly sure about how many more species are there that are yet to be discovered and explored and described, right? So for many taxonomic groups, if you look at their inventories is where you make a list of how many species, what kind of species are present in a particular region. If you look at the inventories are more complete in the temperate regions as compared to the tropical regions. In the temperate countries, the species inventories are more complete in the temperate countries as compared to the tropical countries. So what can we do? In temperate, if you consider birds, this is how many species of birds that are present. How many could be present in the tropics? You can find out because there are certain species for which the temperate countries and the tropical countries, both inventories have been almost complete. Okay? Listen carefully. You have the temperate countries and then you have the tropical countries. In the temperate countries, for several taxonomic groups, the inventories are pretty much complete. But it's not the case in tropical countries. But for some taxonomic groups, like for some insects, the species inventory is pretty much at the same level for both temperate and tropical countries. Okay? So, making use of that, let's say in both temperate and tropical countries, they have extensively studied insects, a group of insects. Now they have data for X is the number of species that you find in temperate, Y is the number of species that you find in a tropical area for insects. This we are pretty much sure of. So, for birds, if you consider, the species inventory in temperate regions is more complete. In tropical, it's not as complete. What they're going to do is, they're going to use this data that they have and try to compare that and try to make a statistical comparison and try to come at a value for how many species of birds you can find in the tropical countries. That's what is given in NCERT. Considering that many species are yet to be discovered, we've not yet found them out, we've not yet described them. So, considering that many species are yet to be discovered in the tropical countries, biologists or ecologists make a statistical comparison of the temperate tropical species richness of an exhaustively studied group of insects and extrapolate this ratio to other groups of mammals and plants to come up with a gross estimate of the total number of species on Earth. For example, in the temperate countries, we are talking about a group of insects. Let's say that group of insects, they found 10k species, and the same group of insects in the tropical, there were probably 30k species. So we know this, the ratio is 1:3. So over here in the temperate countries, if the bird species is 5, they can use the same ratio and kind of make a rough guess that in the tropics, probably 3 times more, 15k bird species must be present. So that's how it's going to work. Alright. So by making these kind of statistical comparisons and coming at values, arriving at values, we will get an idea of how diverse our Earth is, right? So there are some estimates that range from 20 to 50 million. Remember, I told you in the beginning of the session that on Earth currently, the species of plants and animals that have been described are about 1.5 million. So some estimates say that there are a total of 20 to 50 million species, but there are more scientific estimates made by Robert May. So Robert May says that the global species diversity across the world, across different parts of the Earth, the species diversity might be about 7 million. Okay, of 7 million total species, we've only described, discovered, studied 1.5 million species so far, right? Now let's talk about global species diversity. Of all of the species, all of the 1.5 million species that have been described so far, more than 70% are animals. And nearly 22% are plants. I want you to remember one point over here. Though we say nearly 22% is plants, I want you to notice how every time we are talking about plants, they even include fungi in this chapter. Okay, so nearly 22% is plants, and they say it includes algae, bryophytes, gymnosperms, angiosperms and fungi. And the remaining, whatever is remaining, that will be other different groups of organisms. Alright, so this is something that you should remember. Now let's talk about the species diversity of animals at a global level. Across different parts of the world, across the globe, how many different types of animals can we find? Among animals, which group is most diverse? Among animals, insects are the most species-rich taxonomic group, making up more than 70% of the total. If you see here, we are saying that 70% of 1.5 million is animals. Now, if you consider animals alone, among animals, insects occupy more than 70%. Now, what does that mean? 1 in every 7 animals that you see is going to be an insect. 1 in every 7 animals is an insect. That is insane, because that is how diverse insects are, right? So, all of the other animal groups will be under 30%. Insects are the most taxonomically species rich group. What does that mean? Insects have the highest number of species. Like, can you name us some? I give you some examples in the beginning. There's ant, and then there's beetles, and then there's butterflies, and there are so many different types of bees, and there are spiders, so many different kinds of insects, right? That's just how many I can think of right now. But if you consider all of the animals, among all of the animals, more than 70% is insects itself. All right, so this is one thing that you should remember. Now, among invertebrates, if you consider, obviously you've studied about invertebrates in your 11th grade Animal Kingdom chapter. I'm sure you remember something from it. Under invertebrates, you have sponges and coelentrates and ctenophores and flatworms, aschelminthes, all of those different groups, right? So if you consider all of those animal invertebrate groups, if you consider animals as a whole itself, insects are more than 70%. But if you consider invertebrates also, insects exhibit the most species diversity. Quickly following insects, you have mollusks. And then you have crustaceans. Crustaceans you mostly find in aquatic marine habitats. They are also arthropods. Insects are also arthropods. So, and then all of the other animal groups. Over here, you have the rest of invertebrates. Plus all of the chordates. All right. So, over here you can see that insects are the most species diverse when it comes to invertebrates. Now, let's talk about vertebrates. Among vertebrates, fishes. Which are the vertebrates? You have fishes, amphibians, reptiles, aves, mammals, right? So, among vertebrates, maximum species diversity is exhibited by fishes. Following that, you have birds. Then you have reptiles, amphibians, finally mammals. Okay, so this is the order that you'll have to remember. F, B, Ram. Least species diversity that we see is of mammals. Highest is of fishes. Next, greatest is birds. Then reptiles, then amphibians, then finally mammals. So this is the correct sequence of species diversity that we see in vertebrates. Now we've learnt enough about global species diversity of animals. Let's consider the global species diversity that we see in plants. In plants, like I already said earlier, they include fungi also in this chapter. In plants, angiosperms are the most species diverse. Since they've included fungi also in plants, you can see how the species diversity in angiosperms and fungi are pretty much the same. Then you have ferns and its allies. You have mosses here which are bryophytes, ferns are pteridophytes. Then you have lichens, and then you have algae. Okay, so this is how this species diversity of plants is across the globe, including all of the different parts of the world. Now, when we are talking about all of these estimates of how many species are present across the globe, how many have we discovered, how many are we yet to find out, which is more species diverse, which is least species diverse, and all of that. So far, I've never even spoken about prokaryotes, right? Prokaryotes include bacteria. So we do not have like an estimate for species diversity of prokaryotes. Why don't we have that? Excuse me. One reason is whatever taxonomical methods that we use to kind of describe plants and animals. The conventional taxonomic methods, they are not suitable to describe, identify prokaryotic organisms like bacteria. Also, it's not easy for us to culture all the different types of bacteria in laboratories on culture plates. So it is not possible to culture all species of prokaryotes in labs. That is one reason. Another reason is that by making use of conventional taxonomic methods, it's not, basically they're not suitable to describe prokaryotes. Whatever methods we use for plants and animals, the same methods cannot be used, or they are not suitable for prokaryotes. So these are the two reasons why we do not have an estimate for prokaryotes. But if you start looking at the biodiversity or the species richness of prokaryotes, I'm sure the prokaryotes number itself will run to millions, right? That too many species of prokaryotes we can find on this earth. So that's about species diversity of prokaryotes. Now let's talk about our country, our motherland, India, and how species diverse is our country, India. Now let's look at the area India occupies in the world. Here we have the world map. Okay, so there are so many different countries, and this is the land area that different countries occupy, and here is our beloved country, India. As you can see, India does not occupy a lot of area in the world. If you consider the land area that India occupies in the world, it's just about 2.4%. Despite occupying just 2% of the land area of the entire world, its contribution to global species diversity is at a staggering 8.1%. It's more than thrice of its land area. Land area is just 2.4%, but the global species diversity that it contributes to is 8.1%, because of which India is regarded as one of the 12 mega diversity countries. What does that mean? It means that in India we find so many different species of plants and different animal groups, which is why we call it one of the 12 mega diversity countries. In India alone, we find around 45,000 species of plants. We find nearly 90,000 species of animals. We saw in Robert May's estimate that so far we've discovered about 1.5 million species in the world. There is a total of around 7 million species on Earth. If you apply the same ratio to how many have been found in India, how many have been discovered, and how many are yet waiting to be discovered, we can clearly say that there are probably more than 1 lakh plant species and more than 3 lakh animal species that have not yet been discovered, not yet been studied, not yet been described in India. This is the number of plants and animals that we know of right now. There are so many present inside the forest that we've not yet discovered. We've not yet managed to study them. So, if all of them are studied, then we'll probably have more than 1 lakh plant species and 3 lakh animal species. Right now, they're there. They're existing somewhere, hidden, away from us, away from our reach. We don't know about them. We don't have the exact data about them. But it is estimated that these many species of animals and these many species of plants are present, waiting to be discovered in different regions of India, right? Now, if you talk about biodiversity, I just now mentioned how, despite occupying a small geographical area in the world, India as a country contributes to a very high level of biodiversity, species diversity specifically in the world. There could be some countries, of course there are some countries that are much larger in area compared to India, but still over there the species diversity is far less. What does this indicate? This means that species diversity is not uniform throughout the world. There are certain regions where the species diversity is much high compared to other regions where the species diversity is not as high. Alright, so over here I want you to remember time and again that when I say species diversity, I'm not talking about the population, I'm talking about the number of species that are present in that area, right? So the diversity of plants and animals is not uniform across different types, different parts of the world. Now, if you consider Earth, you know there are different latitudes, there are different longitudes and all of that you've learnt about in your geography classes probably. So what I want you to understand here is if you go from the center, from the equator towards the poles, if you move from the equator towards the poles, it could be the South Pole or the North Pole, biodiversity or the species diversity is going to decrease steadily. Maximum diversity you will see in the equatorial region. From the equator on either sides you have the tropics, then you have the subtropics, and then you have the temperate regions, right? So as you move from the equator towards the poles, the species diversity is going to steadily decrease, right? So the tropics are the regions which lie between 23.5 degree north latitude and 23.5 degree south latitude. Those regions are called the tropics, and India for its most part lies in the tropical region itself, right? So compared to the temperate and the polar regions, towards the equator and towards the tropics, within the tropics, we will find more species diversity. So this is the pattern of biodiversity that we see in nature, right? It's more diverse wherever. Where is it more diverse? At the equator, at the tropics. Where is it less? As you move from the equator towards the poles, it's going to gradually, steadily decrease, right? So that's called latitudinal gradient. Gradient basically means difference. You're going to see difference in species diversity as you move from here towards either poles. Because it's happening across or along the latitudes, we call this latitudinal gradients, right? Now, let's take the example of the bird species diversity. If you consider a country like Colombia, Colombia is present very, very close to the equator. It is present within the tropical region. In Colombia, you find around 1400 species of birds. If you consider a country like India, India also lies in the tropical region. We have about 1200 species of birds. If you consider New York, New York is a state in the United States of America in USA. Over there, it falls in the temperate region. So from the equator, from the tropics, you're moving towards the poles. Over here, you can see how the number of species of birds is just 105. It's so much less than what it was at the equator. This is true for most taxonomic groups. Now, if you consider Greenland, Greenland is much far from the equator. It is present in the Arctic region. Over here, the species diversity of birds is just 56. Look at how much variation there is as you move from the equator towards the poles. This is one example. Let's take another example. Let's consider a forest. We'll consider a forest area in two different regions. The area of the forest is the same, but we are considering it in two different regions. One is in Ecuador. Ecuador, as the name itself indicates, is very close to the equator. It's pretty much on the equator. I mean, the equator falls on this Ecuador. And we'll consider a region midwest of USA. This is temperate. So let's say you're considering the same area of forest in two different regions. One region is in the tropics, one is in the temperate region. If you consider the vascular plant diversity, vascular plant species diversity in both of these areas, when you compare them, you can see clearly how the species diversity in Ecuador is 10 times, minimum 10 times greater than the vascular plant species diversity that you find in Midwest USA. Now, what are these vascular plants? Vascular plants include all of your pteridophytes, gymnosperms and angiosperms, right? So, if you consider these groups of plants and the species diversity in Midwest of USA, temperate region, Ecuador, near the equator, you can see how the species diversity in Ecuador of vascular plants is about 10 times greater than how much it is in the temperate Midwest of USA. Okay, so this is another example. Now, when we talk about biodiversity, you can never not talk about the Amazon rainforest. Amazon rainforest is also called lungs of the planet. This is a rainforest that you find in South America. On the entire planet, on the earth entirely, maximum biodiversity is found in the Amazon rainforest. In these rainforests, there could be at least 2 million insect species that are yet to be discovered and given names. So in this Amazon rainforest, how many species of different taxa are we going to see? There are more than 40,000 species of plants that you find there, about 427 species of mammals, around 1300 species of birds, 378 species of reptiles, 427 species of amphibians, 3000 species of fishes, and invertebrate species is much greater than 1,25,000. So over here, every number is the number of species of organisms that I'm talking about. So you can clearly see how in the Amazon rainforest, we can see a maximum species diversity throughout the world, right? Now, we already know from several examples that species diversity is highest at the equator, at the tropics, and as you move towards the pole, the species diversity is gradually going to decrease. What could be the reasons for that? This is important. There are 3 reasons why we see maximum biodiversity in tropics compared to the temperate regions, compared to the polar regions. First reason, speciation is a function of time. Speciation is a function of time. What is speciation? You may have learnt about it in your evolution chapter in 12th grade. Speciation is formation of new species. New species will arise from pre-existing species. Now, you've learnt about evolution of man. There was Ramapithecus, there was Dryopithecus, and there are so many other of our ancestors, right? Prehistoric men. Now, if we say that Neanderthal man evolved into Cro-Magnon man, it did not happen overnight. It is not like Neanderthal man slept as Neanderthal man and when he woke up he was Cro-Magnon man, right? It is a function of time. It happens over a very long period of time. It's not quick. It happens slowly, gradually with time. Of course, there are, if it's happening, of course it can happen in a very short period of time as well. That's a different story, but most species form, speciation happens it requires a gradual time, right? What happened in the temperate areas was, you may have seen in movies like Ice Age, in the past, there were very frequent glaciations. Because of this, though there was high diversity, many of them were killed. But such glaciations we did not see in the tropical regions. In the tropical regions, over several thousand years, the conditions, environmental conditions, have pretty much been stable. Because of that, there was better conditions for evolution, better conditions for diversification, better conditions for speciation. As the species diverged, as diversification happened, more and more species got added to what was existing in the tropical regions, which is one of the reasons why the biodiversity is higher in the tropics compared to the subtropics, compared to the temperate and the polar areas. Secondly, if you consider annually, per year, every year, the variations in seasons seasonal variations, whatever happen, they are compared to temperate regions. In the tropical regions, there is not very drastic variations in seasons and it is very predictable, because of which niche specialization happens. Take for example, two people. One person is learning painting. Every day, 1 hour he's practicing. And there's another person who's learning painting and he's also learning to play the keyboard. For 1 year, the first person practices for 1 hour every day of the year. Another person, for the first 6 months, for the first 3 months, he practices painting, and then he practices the keyboard for the next 3 months, and then he's practicing painting for the next 3 months, and then he alternates like that. Within a year, there's painting, and then keyboard, and then painting and keyboard. At the end of the year, who will be a better painter? The first child who practiced painting every day throughout the year, right? So you have to apply the same analogy over here as well. When a species have to evolve and diversify, the kind of conditions that we give that species should not be very variable. When you're giving such predictable, constant environments, they specialize in that one and then they eventually evolve and diversify. If you're constantly changing the environment for them, we're not giving them enough time to specialize in that particular area. As a result of which, we see that in the tropics, where the temperature, where the environmental conditions are pretty much stable, relatively stable and predictable, over there, greater evolution, greater diversification will happen as opposed to the plants and animals that you find in the temperate regions, right? So since it is relatively more constant and predictable, that promotes niche specialization, and as a result, we have a greater species diversity. Third, if you consider the amount of sunlight different parts of the world receive, you know that towards the equator, at the temperate tropical regions, the countries in the tropical regions, they receive the maximum sunlight compared to the temperate countries. You know how important sunlight is as an abiotic factor to an ecosystem. The producers in an ecosystem depend on sunlight, and because of sunlight, they can produce glucose. So the productivity of plants depends on sunlight. Since the sunlight is available in greater amounts in the tropical countries compared to the temperate countries, here we can see the productivity will be higher. Because the productivity is higher, it will have the ability to support more number of species, which is not the case in temperate countries, because over there the amount of sunlight those countries receive is far less compared to the countries in the tropical areas, right? Okay. The second pattern of biodiversity that we have to talk about is the species area relationship. This is very interesting and it is very important. What you're looking at here is called, is basically a graph. There's this person called Alexander von Humboldt. He was an ecologist. He was very much interested in nature and exploring different kinds of things. So he was exploring. He went about exploring some jungles that were in South America. Remember, that's where the Amazon rainforest is also. So based on his observations from his exploration, what he found out was, within a region, if you're considering a region, within that region, as you increase the explored area, the species richness is going to increase. With increase in area, species richness increases. But that happens only up to a limit. Over here, look here. On the y-axis, you have species richness. This basically is an indicator of how many different species are present in that area. And on the x-axis, you have area itself. It's behind this, so you can't see it. On the x-axis, you have area. As you increase the area, the species richness is going to increase up until one point, is what he's trying to say. Let's try to apply that to our homes. If you consider our homes, example, in my house, I don't have any pets. So if you consider my house, species richness is the number of different species that you find in that particular area. So in my house, you will definitely find humans. You will find a tulsi plant, that is one plant species. You will find a cactus plant, that is one plant species. You'll probably find a population of mosquitoes. You'll probably find, what else do we have? Some flies, Drosophila, like a fruit fly. So this is the species richness in just my house. Now let's go and explore. Now let's increase this area that we are exploring and look at my street. In my street, of course, there are humans. Some of the houses have pets. So there are fishes, there are cats, there are dogs, there are crows, there are trees in the road, there are tulsi plants. The number of species is going to increase. Species richness is going to increase. Now look at a city. You know, in Bangalore, in different parts of the cities, you have different kinds of avenue trees. So whatever trees are found in the street that I live in may not be the same species as the trees that are found in some other street, right? So if you're considering a larger area, obviously the species richness is going to increase. So what he is trying to say here is, as you increase the area, as the area that you're exploring increases, you can see how the species richness is also increasing. So when you plot it as a graph, you get a rectangular hyperbola. This is what you get. And by convention, how do you represent a rectangular hyperbola in an equation? S is equal to Ca to the power of z. And on a log scale, you get a linear graph for that. That is represented by the equation log S is equal to log C plus Z log A or Z log A. This is very similar to the linear equation y is equal to mx plus c. Over here, m always represents the slope. In this case, z represents the slope, or we even call it the regression coefficient. What does S stand for here? S is for species richness, A is for area, C is the y-intercept, and Z is the slope of that line or the regression coefficient. Now, if the value of Z is high, the slope will be steeper. If the value of Z is low, the slope will be less steep, more flat. Okay? Now, excuse me. If you discover the value of Z in different areas, it usually ranges from 0.1 to 0.2. It does not matter what taxonomic group you're considering. It does not matter which part of the world you're considering. But for most taxonomic groups in every part of the world, the value pretty much lies in the range of 0.1 to 0.2. For example, if you're studying the plants in Britain, you could be studying the bird diversity in California. You could be studying mollusks in New York. Regardless of where it is, the range is going to be between 0.1 to 0.2. But if you analyze species area relationships in very large areas, like entire continent, then it's going to be very steep. Its value can be anywhere from 0.6 to 1.2. For example, if you consider the fruit-eating bats and birds and mammals in the tropical forest of different continents, the slope is found to be 1.15. Why is that? That's because you're considering an extremely large area, right? Now, let's talk about why is species diversity important for an ecosystem. All right, I get it. India or the world, for that matter, harbors so many different species of plants and animals and microbes and all of that. Of course, there are different types of species, but why should I worry about conserving them? Okay, I mentioned there are 20,000 species of ants, about 20,000 species of ants. What if 5,000 of them go extinct? Why should it matter to me? It doesn't really make much of a difference in my life, will it? Some of you might think like that. So it's really essential for you to understand what is the importance of biodiversity. So uh, many ecologists have performed several experiments and done a lot of research and studies regarding the stability of an ecosystem. Ecologists, based on their studies, have come to a conclusion that whichever communities have more number of species, they tend to be more stable than those with less species. If you consider two areas, in one area you have 50 different species of plants, in another area you have 5 different species of plants. Let's say both of those areas are hit by drought, there's not sufficient water in the soil. Then the first kind of ecosystem with more species diversity kind of knows how to get through that challenge and will come out, successful at the end. It will still survive as an ecosystem. But the area that has only 5 different species of plants might not survive it, right? So the more number of species there is in an area, the more species diversity there is, better will be the stability of the ecosystem. How exactly this works, we don't know yet. But what they've understood from performing so many different kinds of experiments and studies is that if the species diversity is more, then obviously it will contribute to the stability of that particular ecosystem. How can we measure the stability of an ecosystem? What is a stable ecosystem? What does that mean? If an ecosystem is stable, it means that year after year, it will not show much variation in its productivity. I'm sure you've heard about productivity. We've learned about it in ecosystem chapter. There's primary productivity, secondary productivity, net primary productivity, gross primary productivity, all of that. We've discussed that in the previous chapter. So here what I want you to understand is if a community is said to be stable, then it should not show much variation year after year when it comes to productivity. The second point is that even though there are occasional disturbances in the form of natural or man-made disturbance, it could be a drought, it could be a flood, it could be forest fire, whatever reason, these areas should have resistance or resilience and should not be affected by that disturbance. It should always bounce back. All right. Next, it should also be resistant to alien species invasion. Alien species invasion we've discussed when we spoke about the what is that? That cactus that was introduced into Australia, and then all of the other species of plants that were native to Australia, it was not growing well there. We've discussed this example in the chapter ecosystem, right? So what are these alien species invasions? I'll tell you about this. Invasions, I'm sure you've heard in history, you've studied in history, where you learn about people that don't originally belong to that state, that region. They come from some other part of the world, they take us over, and they will kind of not allow our growth to take place. You've seen how many invaders came from different parts of the world. They kind of destroyed our temples, they took away our identity and all of that. So that is invasion. They don't belong to this area, they come from somewhere else and they take control of that area. That happens a lot in nature as well. So there could be a plant that don't belong to India. So you get that plant from some other region to India. It could be voluntarily, by choice, you're bringing it here because it probably has beautiful flowers, or by mistake, by chance, it has somehow found a place in India. So this alien species, we call it alien species because it didn't originally belong here. This alien species will start acting like an invader and it will cause a threat to the species that have been existing here since several thousands of years. So that is alien species invasion. So if at all there is any alien species that gains entry into a community, then because of that, a community should not get disturbed. If it doesn't get disturbed, then we say it is a stable community, right? Now, let's talk about certain experiments that this person called David Tillman performed. Certain ecosystem experiments, and he made use of outdoor plots. Okay, so this basically explains this stability of an ecosystem. He had different kinds of plots that showed different types of species diversity. In some plots, the species diversity was very high, in some it was very less. What he found out from his experiments is that whichever areas or whichever regions had more species diversity, there was less year-to-year variation in total biomass and also higher productivity. Okay? Now, like I mentioned earlier, why should it matter to us if species are getting extinct? Okay, Western Ghats have a lot of amphibian species that you don't find anywhere else in the world. What if that one frog species get extinct? Why should it matter to me who does not have anything to do with that frog species? Why should I worry about it at all? This could be a question in many of you all. The reason I'm going to emphasize on this point again and again is that it's really important. It is us and you all, the next generation, who has to take care of the biodiversity. To explain that, there is a very, very beautiful analogy that a person called Paul Ehrlich has used to explain. It's basically called the rivet popper hypothesis. For this, we are comparing an aeroplane with an ecosystem. In an aeroplane, it's not one unit, right? You have different parts that are put together by means of screws and nuts that we call rivets. If an airplane is considered as an ecosystem, there are different parts that are joined together by the rivets, the nuts and the bolts and the screws and all of that, right? So those rivets that are used for binding together different parts of the airplane is what we compare with the species. Many species, many rivets together make the airplane, give form to the airplane. Similarly, many species come together in an ecosystem. Now let's say this airplane is functional. It's traveling from different parts of the world, across different parts of the world, and there are a lot of passengers that are traveling in this airplane on a daily basis. Now imagine every passenger that's traveling in this airplane decides to pop off one rivet from this airplane. Let's say one person takes it out of from below the seat. Will it matter for the safety of the aeroplane? Over here, flight safety can be compared with how properly the ecosystem functions, because we're comparing airplane with the ecosystem. The safety of the aeroplane is compared with the safety or how well the ecosystem is working. Okay, so there are thousands of rivets, there are thousands of species in an ecosystem. Imagine every person that travels in that aeroplane pops one rivet each time and takes it home. Now you can kind of correlate popping of those rivets to species going extinct in an ecosystem. If a rivet is popped off from under the seat, it may not cause much difference to the safety of the aeroplane. Some species going extinct may not make that much of a difference to the functioning of an ecosystem. Now, imagine people who traveled in that plane started popping off rivets from the wings. Initially, it might not matter much, it might not it might not come in the way of the airplane safety, but as and when people pop off rivets from the wings, what is going to happen? The airplane is not going to be safe, it's not going to fly properly, right? Very similarly, there are some species in every ecosystem that we call the keystone species. Many species of animals or organisms depend on the keystone species for many reasons. So, if those keystone species that drive several ecosystem functions go extinct, all of those functions are going to be, it's going to be affected, right? So, in that way, whenever species go extinct, sooner or later, it will affect the ecosystem that the species was a part of. For example, consider bees. Bees are pollinators, they're very important in an ecosystem. Imagine bees go extinct. For so many species of plants, bees are the pollinators. What will happen if pollination does not happen? Seeds will not form. If the seeds don't form, there is no next generation that you can get. If bees go extinct, all of the plants that are exclusively pollinated by bees will also go extinct. All of those plants that are pollinated by bees, they probably produce delicious fruits, they probably produced vegetables, so you're not going to get to taste any of them anymore. So it matters. Every species matters, and it's our moral duty to safeguard all of those species and make sure it doesn't go extinct because of our activities, right? So that is Paul Ehrlich's rivet popper hypothesis that you should know. Now let's talk about loss of biodiversity. It's a very alarming concern because currently biodiversity is getting lost at a very, very high rate. Now, once the tropical Pacific Islands initially did not have humans. Humans colonized the tropical Pacific Islands, and once humans colonized the tropical Pacific Islands, more than 2,000 species of native birds went extinct. That's what humans are capable of. They went into that island, they colonized that island, and they killed the native species of birds that probably evolved there and they were happily thriving there just because of human activities. Because of over exploiting those birds for his food, humans caused extinction of not one, not two, 20,000 species of birds from that islands. We saw even in the chapter ecosystem how we learnt about different population interactions. We spoke about predation, and then I told you that predators are usually prudent. They don't kill the prey unless they are hungry, but humans are not like that. Regardless of you're hungry or not, we are known to exploit the nature, right? Which can be explained with this example right here. So the IUCN Red List basically documents the threat the different species are facing. Some species face no threat like us humans. There are some species that if you don't take action will go extinct. There are some species that are extinct in the wild, but you can find them only in zoological parks. So different species are given different tags based on how much of a threat they are facing. Okay? So according to this IUCN Red List in 2024, in the last 500 years, 784 species have gone extinct, which includes 338 vertebrates, 359 invertebrates, and 87 species of plants. And why do you think this has happened? This has happened because of human activities, human greed, okay? Which is what we all should try to avoid. Some examples of the recent extinctions are the dodo. The dodo is a beautiful little bird that you used to find in Mauritius earlier, but it's no more there because it's extinct. And then you have quagga from Africa, and then thylacine. This looks a little bit like a fox and a little bit like a dog. Very cute little creature in Australia. Stellar sea cow in Russia, and 3 subspecies of the mighty tiger. 3 subspecies of the mighty tiger in Asia that were found in Bali and Java and Caspian. Yeah, the 3 subspecies are Bali, Javan and Caspian. These 3 subspecies of tiger have gone extinct in the recent past. So, in the last 20 years alone, there have been extinction of about 27 species globally. So, one thing we must understand here is that extinctions that happen do not happen randomly across different taxa. There are certain taxonomic groups that are more prone to extinction, that are more at a risk of extinction compared to the others. For example, amphibians are very much vulnerable to extinction. Currently, more than 15,500 species of organisms are facing the threat of extinction. 12% of all birds, 23% of all mammals, 32% of all amphibians, 31% of all gymnosperms are currently facing the threat of extinction. So, we are talking a lot about extinction right now, but is it the first time that extinctions have happened? Extinctions happen, they are a common process, common occurrence in nature. But within a short period of time, within a short span of time, multiple species going extinct is what we call mass extinctions. Several mass extinctions have happened even before humans evolved. In fact, there have been 5 episodes of mass extinctions before humans evolved on this planet. Currently also, we are facing the 6th episode of mass extinction. But what differs the other extinctions compared to the 6th extinction that's occurring right now? Right now, whatever extinction is happening is mostly because of human activities or anthropogenic activities. So, also, it is at a much higher rate compared to what it was in the previous 5 episodes of mass extinctions. The current 6th extinction rate are estimated to be 100 to 1000 times faster than it was in the pre-human times. And it is our activities, it is the human activities that is mostly responsible for this. Several ecologists have even studied and told us that nearly half of all of the species that are present on this planet can go extinct within the next 100 years if we do not actively work towards conserving them. That is why it's so important for us to conserve the biodiversity around us. It might seem like nothing to you, but this chapter is only to show you, open your eyes and understand how important biodiversity is for an ecosystem and what is the need for us to save our ecosystem and save our species, right? Now, what will happen if there is a loss of biodiversity in any region? Plant production will reduce. Remember, I told you greater the biodiversity, greater will be the productivity. So, plant production will reduce. If at all there is any disturbance in the environment, there will be lowered resistance. They won't be as resistant if the biodiversity is less. Certain ecosystem processes like plant productivity, water use, pest and disease cycles, there will be increased variability. That will vary very drastically from year to year if there is a loss of biodiversity. Now, what basically causes biodiversity loss? I told you from the start that it is mostly our activities which are causing the loss of biodiversity, right? There are 4 major causes which we call the evil quartet. Quart is 4. Since there are 4, we call it the evil quartet. First reason is habitat loss and fragmentation. Second reason is overexploitation. Third reason is alien species invasion. And the fourth reason is co-extinction. So these 4 are the major reasons for loss of biodiversity that we're facing currently. And all of them are because of human activities. Let's understand each of them one by one, starting with habitat loss and fragmentation. I'm sure you know what habitat is. Habitat is basically the address of the organism. Where does it live is the habitat. Habitat loss is that organism becoming homeless because the forest was probably cut down for something else, or that area was converted into something else. What was once a grassland is probably now a tall building. So that particular organism has lost its house forever. That is habitat loss. What is habitat fragmentation? There was one big piece of land. So in this piece of land, in this area, so this used to be a forest. In this area that I'm marking right now, they cut down the trees and they started growing some other plants. In this area, they started growing some other plants. This has been converted into a cropland. What was once a big continuous land, a continuous forest, is now fragmented, is now broken down. That is fragmentation. What will be the effect of that? There are some animals that require very large territories for it to function properly. For example, our big cats like tigers and lions need large territories. If their habitat is fragmented, then 2 lions probably will come opposite each other and they fight and then they end up killing each other, right? So that can happen. So habitat loss and fragmentation is the most important cause that is driving animals and plants to extinction. One example for that is the Amazon rainforest or the tropical rainforest that once covered more than 14% of the Earth's land surface covers just about 6% now. Like I already mentioned, Amazon rainforest is called the lungs of the planet. It probably harbors millions of species and is being cut for at a very, very rapid rate for converting that forest into grasslands and for cultivating soybeans over there. And the reason why they're cutting these forests and converting it into grassland is because they need food for cattle. Why do they need to feed cattle? Because they want to kill that and make beef and eat the cattle meat. Because of that, large areas of forests are being cleared out. Excuse me. Also, many habitats are being polluted. There are not many species, there are several species that do not grow well in polluted areas. So it's a threat for those species as well. Like I already mentioned, whenever large habitats are broken down into smaller fragments, the mammals and birds requiring large territories and certain animals and birds with migratory habits will be severely affected and their population will decline. Next point, overexploitation. Humans always are not needy, they are greedy. They don't just take what is required, they take more and more and more and keep taking until there's nothing left, right? Humans have always depended on nature. We depend on nature, we still do. We depend on nature for food, we depend on nature for furniture, we depend on nature for medicine. But you should only take as much as you need. When the need turns into greed, it leads to over-exploitation of natural resources. Like I told you how when the Pacific Islands were newly colonized by humans, how 2,000 species of birds went extinct, right? So many species have faced extinction in the last 500 years. For example, Steller sea cow, passenger pigeon, they were overexploited by humans. They killed them, they ate them. They killed them, they ate them. They kept killing and eating until no more of that species was left, right? So even currently, many species of fish, marine species of fish around the world are over harvested so that their species are also under threat. That is overexploitation. Alien species invasion. Alien species invasion, I already spoke about what alien species invasion is. If there is any species of plant or animal that didn't originally belong in that region, have been moved to that region intentionally or accidentally, that alien species will start invading that area, take control over it, not allow the species that were originally present there to grow well and completely make it, unbalanced, right? So imbalanced is the right word, I think. Yeah. So that is what alien species invasion is. Yeah. So whatever species are have been present there since the beginning, naturally present there, they are called the indigenous species. There is this fish called Nile perch. In East Africa, there's a lake called Lake Victoria. This Nile perch was introduced into the Lake Victoria. Eventually, it led to the extinction of more than 200 species of indigenous fishes in that area. Next, you all heard about Parthenium or carrot grass. I'm sure all of you have seen this plant called Lantana camara. And then you have water hyacinth, which is also called Eichhornia. These are also invasive species that do not allow other plants around it to grow well, right? Recently, African catfish called Clarius glariepinus has been introduced into India for aquaculture purposes. This is also posing a threat to the indigenous catfish that were present in India. So these are examples that you have to remember. Co-extinctions. When one species go extinct, another species that depends on this obligately, that will also go extinct. Okay? So if there is an obligatory relationship between these two, like they both cannot live without each other, then if one of them goes extinct, the other one will also go extinct. For example, if there is a host fish, if it becomes extinct, all of the parasites that would depend on this host will also go extinct because they do not have a host now. If you consider how there are For example, we learnt about mutualism, we learnt about this moth having a symbiotic relationship with the fig and how the moth helps in pollination and the fig allows the moth to lay its eggs there, right? So over there, both these species are depending on each other for reproduction. The fig plant, within the inflorescence, pollination is happening because of the moth. With pollination, it's helping in reproduction. The fig is in turn helping this moth to lay her eggs, which is helping in reproduction. So both are helping each other out for reproduction. Reproduction ensures continuity of generation. If the moth goes extinct, there will be no pollinators for fig. If there are no pollinators, there is no seed setting. If there is no seed setting, there is no next generation. So if the moth goes extinct, the fig plant also will go extinct. That is co-extinction for you, right? Now let's talk about why we should conserve biodiversity. There are three arguments there: narrowly utilitarian, broadly utilitarian, and ethical reasons. First, let's talk about narrowly utilitarian argument. Basically, why we should conserve our nature is because we can make money out of it, because it gives us a lot of things. It gives us food, it gives us fiber, it gives us firewood, materials for construction, industrial products like tannins, resins, lubricants, dyes, perfumes, and all of that, and many products of medicinal importance. In fact, more than 25% of the drugs that we currently sell in the market worldwide are derived from plants. About 25,000 species of plants are contributing to the traditional medicine worldwide. So that's how important it is for us, because they benefit us, because we can derive things from the biodiversity. We should save them. Again, you're selfish here. You want to save it because you know that it will produce something that will be of use to you. That is one way, or one way to think about why you should conserve biodiversity. The second reason is broadly utilitarian. This is because nature gives us so many things free of cost and you don't have to pay for it. Pollination ensures continuity of species for plants. Those plants produce food that you can eat. So can you put a price tag on how much pollination should cost? If at all pollinators go extinct, if you were to do it manually, how much would it cost? So the pollinators are doing their job for free, right? Nobody's paying them to pollinate plants. That is one thing. And plants produce oxygen for us. For how long can you stay holding your breath? You can't, because our body needs oxygen. We are aerobic organisms, right? Without oxygen, we cannot stay alive for a long time. So, nature is giving us oxygen for free. Can you really put a price tag on just enjoying the beauty of nature? All of you think about hashtag wanderlust. You want to travel different places and you enjoy trekking and hiking and spending time in nature amidst all of that greenery. You can't really put a price tag on all of that, right? Because of that, because you want the next generations to enjoy the same beauty that you have enjoyed, you want to conserve nature, right? That is broadly utilitarian argument. Now, ethical argument. Who am I to decide what species to go extinct, what species should stay? All of the species, how small or big, how mighty or weak, how useful or useless, regardless of its use to humans, they have an intrinsic value. They deserve to stay on Earth, they deserve not to go extinct, and they deserve to stay on the planet as much as we do. That is the ethical argument. So it is our moral responsibility as humans being on top of the food chain, as humans being the most intelligent of all species, it is our moral duty to be a voice for the organisms who cannot speak, for the organisms who cannot think. So as an intelligent human, it is your moral responsibility to make sure that every organism, every species that exists on this earth should not go extinct. So that is the ethical argument. Now, what are the different ways in which we can conserve biodiversity? There are two important approaches that we take. One is in situ and the second one is ex situ. In situ is on the same site, ex situ is off site. If you want to save a tiger, you save the entire forest. that is in situ. So to save the tiger, you save the entire area where the tiger is present. So you're conserving the species in its natural habitat, that is in situ conservation. Ex situ conservation is saving organisms, conserving organisms in an area that is not its natural habitat. We'll discuss both these in detail. Let's talk about in situ conservation first. We have some examples like biodiversity hotspots and protected reserves. There are several biodiversity hotspots in the world. Initially, there were 25, they've added 9 more to it. So now there are a total of 34 biodiversity hotspots in the world. What are these hotspots for biodiversity? These are areas in which there is a very, very high species diversity. Species diversity is very high. Secondly, many species there are going extinct very rapidly. So we must take immediate care of that particular region. We must, try to conserve the species as much as possible. Thirdly, there is a high degree of endemism. What do we mean by endemism? Endemic species are those species that are found in a particular area and nowhere else in the world. For example, if you consider the lion-tailed macaque, it's a type of monkey that you find only in the Western Ghats and nowhere else in the world. So, such species are called endemic species. If they go extinct from that particular area, they're extinct forever. It's not like, okay, in India mango got extinct, we can find that in Bangladesh. It does not work like that. That species is present only in that part of the world. So we must very actively work towards conserving those species. So if an area has very high biodiversity, very rich species diversity, species over there are getting lost in the blink of an eye, they're going extinct at a very high rate, and there are a lot of endemic species, a lot of keystone species, we declare that area as a biodiversity hotspot, and there are a lot of measures taken by different government organizations, non-government organizations also to ensure that that region's biodiversity is conserved, right? Another thing is protected areas. We have biosphere reserves, national parks, sacred groves and wildlife sanctuaries. There are a total of 14 biosphere reserves in India, about 90 national parks and 448 wildlife sanctuaries in India. So all of these will help in conserving biodiversity. Now, what are these sacred groves? You may have noticed how in India, in our culture, we have a certain respect for plants and animals. For example, if you look at Ganesha, it has the head of an elephant, right, which is an animal. So you look at Ganesha, you look at an elephant, you have that feeling of, what do we say, respect or reverence towards elephant, and the moment you look at it, you will feel like it's Lord Ganesha. If you see a mouse, you will feel like it's Ganesha's Vahana. If you look at a lion, it's like Narasimha for you. You also have known how every one of our gods in Hindu gods, they have their own Vahanas. So, in Subramanya Swami's Vahana is the peacock, right? And Shiva's Vahana is the bull, the Nandi. So, we have certain, religious sentiments attached to different animals and plants. So, we tend to conserve them. Similarly, in different parts of India, different parts of the world, in fact, there are certain regions, biogeographical regions, that have that religious sentiment attached towards it, that have some cultural sentiments attached towards it, because of which people in that area, the natives in that area, worship the plants and animals that are present there, and they make sure that the biodiversity in that area is conserved. We refer to it as sacred groves. We have many such sacred groves in our India itself. In Meghalaya, in the northeastern part of India, we have Khasi and Jaintia hills. In Rajasthan, we have Aravalli hills. Western Ghats that runs from Karnataka, Kerala, Maharashtra, Goa, all of those regions. There also we have sacred groves. And then in Madhya Pradesh, in many areas of Madhya Pradesh like Sarguja, Chanda and Bastar, these regions, there are specific regions of forest, certain tracts of forest that are considered as sacred groves which people worship, they have a lot of respect for, so they are conserved in that way. Now let's talk about ex situ conservation. Ex situ conservation is when you're conserving some organism at a site other than its natural habitat. For example, the threat to rhinos in its natural habitat is very high. So you bring the rhinos to the zoo, give it conditions that are very similar to its natural habitat, give it food at the right time, give it shelter, give it veterinary care, and all of that. You kind of completely taking care of it to make sure that the species will continue to not go extinct. That is ex situ conservation for you. So you can see that in zoos, which are called zoological parks. You can see plants being conserved in botanical gardens, wildlife safaris. And what's important is you can cryopreserve gametes. For example, if you take the gametes from an endangered species, you can store it in liquid nitrogen at minus 196 degrees Celsius. So if you give that chill treatment, cryopreservation it's called, it can stay viable for an extended period of time. So whenever there is a need, you can do artificial, IVF, in vitro fertilization, and that is how you can make sure there is continuation of species. And there are seed banks in which you can store different varieties of different seeds. So you have that genetic variability stored there. These are examples for ex situ conservation. So though biodiversity varies across different parts of the world, there is no political boundary for biodiversity, and all of the countries throughout the world have to work towards conserving our biodiversity. Therefore, it is a collective responsibility of all the countries. So in order to conserve biodiversity, many nations understood the importance of biodiversity and how it impacts the stability of an ecosystem. They conducted something called the Earth Summit in the year 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. Okay, so all of these nations took measures for conservation of biodiversity and sustainable utilization of whatever we get from nature. As a follow-up to that, 10 years later, in the year 2002, a similar summit called the World Summit on Sustainable Development was held in South Africa, Johannesburg. Over here, 190 countries pledged that by the year 2010, a significant reduction would happen in the current rate of biodiversity loss and species extinction at global level, at regional level, and at a local level. So many countries and organizations have also been involved in the conservation of biodiversity. As somebody who understood how important biodiversity is, it is your and my responsibility also to save the biodiversity in us, biodiversity on our planet in whatever little ways we can. So with this, I'm going to sign off from today's session. I hope it was helpful. Thank you for watching till the end. All the very best for your exams. I'll see you soon.